Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. In the last episode, we looked at the development of the world's navies during the interwar period. To complement that, I thought we'd do something similar with aerial warfare. It's easy to forget in 1939 aviation was still very much in its infancy, and especially so aerial warfare. So joining me today is Frank Ledwidge. Frank is a senior fellow in air power and international security at the Royal Air Force College, Cranwell. Not only does he teach this stuff, he's written a book on the subject, Aerial Warfare, The Battle for the Skies. We've already chatted for quite a while, so patrons, look out for an extra 20 or 30 minutes. If you're not already a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcast. That $1 or $2 from each of you really does help me find the time to put the show together, and I am very grateful to those who already support the show. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Frank, thanks for joining me. If we go right back to the birth of flight, I wonder if it was clear from the start that aircraft had a military use. I mean, how quick did the military come sniffing?
It was right from the start. I think people realised that there's a major military potential for this, and I think I say in the book there, Lord Northcliffe, who owned the Daily Mail, sent a telegram to one of his friends just a couple of years later saying aircraft intended, or words to this effect, I can't remember the exact words now, intended for military uses stop. And right from the start, the Wrights, if you forgive the pun, were really keen on getting military contracts and scoured the Western world. They went to Britain looking for contracts from the British Army for reconnaissance aircraft. I don't think they had much luck there, although they did have a lot of interest because there were enthusiasts by that time. We're looking now into 1905, 1906. And, of course, in the United States, where they got limited purchase, and I'm not an expert on it, it's quite specialist, at very early years of powered flight. But as I recall, there were military applications amongst a certain niche, Angus, I think, were very, very clear that there was huge potential for aircraft, specifically in the reconnaissance mode. Although, and again, I mentioned this in the book, there was a lot of pushback. In 1911, there were exercises where the future commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Hague, I think, oversaw these. And what happened there was that the cavalry units were wanting to try and execute some kind of sneaky cavalry move on an infantry unit, and an aircraft was put up and found the cavalry unit, which was dispatched for exercise purposes. And the response from Hague was it was a damned ungentlemanly form of war and should not be encouraged. And it was a view shared by General Foch, who went on to command all Allied forces in the First World War towards the end of the war, who said air power or aircraft said zero, it's nothing, it's of no consequence. But he said that in 1914, before air power essentially saved France in the First Battle of Marne. I hope that's kind of a bit of a survey from 1903 to 1914. I appreciate that, but yes is the answer. I think military application is very clear.
It's funny though that, and I was going to bring this up later. There's civilians doing it, and so now often a lot of the high tech stuff is driven by the military and goes into civilian life. I thought it's kind of interesting that it's a civilian invention that quickly moves into the military sphere as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, that's right, and it's surprising that generally there have been periods, I think, in fact, possibly even much of the sort of sweep of air power history when civilian technology leads. You have that period between 1920 and mid-1930s, probably the sort of post-war period of military-led in aerospace technology. But look, from the 90s onwards, if you look at the way that the sort of Silicon Valley piece, if you like, it's civilian development that's led, with the possible exception of drones. That's the definite exception of drones, and of course, to some extent, satellites. But since the 1990s, it's been civilian-led. Prior to that, really until 1935, military-led. But in the early days, as you say, yeah, it was invented. It wasn't invented as a military device, but its potential was certainly realised at a very early stage.
Yeah. So we don't need to pick through World War One, but I wondered, because people always say that you're fighting your last war. What lessons came out of World War One when they stood there in 1918? Looking back, what are the they weren't necessarily the air forces of the world at this point, were they? There was the military rather than there weren't independent arms.
There was only the one, which was the Royal Air Force, founded on the 1st of April 1918. There was only one independent air force, but you had the Luftstreitkräfte of Germany, which was effectively an independent air arm, although it was tactically focused, as I think you're hinting at. The Italians were moving that way, the French moving that way, and all of them in the early 20s, by the early 20s, all of those major countries, with the exception of the US, had independent air arms, with the beginnings of doctrine. And that doctrine really was surprising. Perhaps I'm jumping ahead here, but the lessons of the First World War weren't really, or rather, the First World War wasn't really used by the major theorists of the 1920s who were supplying the thinking for these new air forces as a background. Because the First World War, air power was certainly an adjunct to the land campaign, with a very few exceptions, I suppose you might say. The German campaign, the Gotha campaign against London, Turk's Cross in 1916, 1917. Which, as I suppose you could say, if you were stretching the term, the world's first strategic air offensive, although I think it is stretching the term. The independent air force, the Allied independent air force of 1918, led by the RAF, arguably a strategic campaign, but these weren't really effective in and of themselves. Air powers, however, whilst not decisive, was really important on the Western Front. And it was at that tactical level, that combined arms level, that by the end of the war, that had really developed. You had, even the Germans were developing by the end of the war, had developed radio-controlled close air support, so you could call in air support at very rudimentary. You had dedicated ground attack aircraft. British were developing those at the end of the war as well. You had extensive use of reconnaissance, which is arguably the real role in which air power excels, for controlling artillery or for informing artillery of targets and adding to their repertoire of means of doing so. You had effective fighter forces to provide the control of the air for all of this. Because, of course, without control of the air, whether it's in 1916 or now, as an enabler, you simply can't exercise any of the roles of air power. And all of that had been realised. But what was interesting, just to come back to the major point I was trying to make, I suppose, is your theorists who were trying to develop the thinking for the new air forces really didn't look back at the First World War for lessons. It's quite surprising. Insofar as they did, those lessons were inaccurate. Trenchard, for example, said that the campaign that they had conducted against Germany in 1918, the moral effect was as 20-1 to the physical, which was probably true because the physical effect was almost zero. But he had no evidence for suggesting that there was any moral effect at all. But nonetheless, despite having no evidence for saying so, British air doctrine of the 1920s and 1930s was to some extent based around this idea of the moral aspect of bombing. Douhet, the Italian theorist, took air power really out of the battlefield altogether.
Where does he come from? He's hugely influential, and he gets mentioned all over the place without people really knowing much about him.
Well, he's an interesting guy. He was, since he's an Italian army officer. He was field rank, I think, as I recall, at the start of the war. But was a major enthusiast for the potential of air power. And he wrote extensively during the First World War on what Italy should do. And he worked closely, I think, and he knew Caproni, the aircraft developer, very well. And between them, what they tried to come up with was the idea of a vast fleet of bombers which could reach behind Austrian lines, because it's often forgotten. I mean, I tell my cadets, I work at Cranwell, as you may know, Angus, and I tell my cadets, this idea we have of the Italian nation as not being very martial is quite a recent idea, I think. If you look at what they were doing in the First World War, Italy did not fight the First World War particularly capably, but it fought it very bravely and took hundreds and hundreds of thousands of casualties for very little gain. And this was realized at the time, and Douhet made the point that the land campaign was going nowhere, that these young men's lives were being wasted, and for his troubles, he was jailed. Whilst in jail, and prior to it, he was writing very heavily, as I said, he was working closely with Caproni, to try and convince the Italians to develop a vast fleet of bombers, which they didn't do. But what they did do, the Italians, is develop the world's first dedicated bomber, the Caproni CA-1, which is, again, often forgotten. And the Italian legacy, of course, of air power, it was the Italians that conducted the first bombing raid over Libya in October 1911, exactly 100 years before NATO bombers are doing exactly the same thing over Libya, by the way, October 2011. So the Italians had a heritage in this. Okay, so there's Douhet in jail, 1917. He was released, exonerated, too late. His ideas were not put into action. And the war ends with huge Italian losses. In the early 1920s, General Douhet, as he was by this time, wrote a book called Command of the Air, which is an eponymous book, if ever there was one, which makes the point that if you have that air power is an entirely new domain of combat, and it's different from the others. Because unlike the Navy and the Army, air power is indifferent to geography, by and large. And that meant that the ideas of Clausewitz, you must have a bloody conflict between armies, or by implication navies, for a war to be won, no longer apply. Those ideas, this is at the very high strategic levels, no longer apply. Because what you can do now with air power is you can strike at the enemy's heart. You can strike at his government, and you can strike hard, strike brutally with gas, with firebombs, to terrorize the population, to terrorize, put pressure on the government for them to surrender, essentially. Broadly speaking, you're flying over the enemy's armies and navies, making them irrelevant. Now, you can only do that if you yourself are the only people about that particular game. And the way to ensure that is to make sure the enemy isn't doing the same to you. So before you embark on this particular endeavor, you make sure that your enemy can't do that to you. And you do that by destroying his air bases, thereby gaining command of the air. Douhet didn't believe, and in fact most people in the early 20s didn't believe, that fighters could have an effective role in resisting bombers, and that was an idea that went on into the 1930s. So having destroyed the enemy's air force, so he can't do it to you, you then, having command of the air, can exercise strategic dominance over the government and win your war. And whilst this is very brutal, it's very savage, you're going to kill a lot of civilians, essentially it's cheaper than getting involved in the kind of mire of blood of the trenches that we saw in the First World War. And it's actually a more humane way of conducting warfare. And that's where Douhet came from, and that's where he ended up. And he has been very, very influential. This idea of, gaining command of the air through taking out enemy's air bases, you see it in the early days of the Second World War, you see it in Barbarossa. And of course, most iconically, you've got the Operation Mockhead in 1967, the Israeli destruction of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. All these explicitly referred back to this idea of offensive counter-air, destroying your enemy's air force on the ground, having command of the air, and winning your war from there on. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, I suppose, but there too.
But it's pertinent insofar as, is that why air warfare is seen as so odious that, we have the Washington Naval Treaty in the 1920s for trying to limit on sea power? Is that why there's Hague Rules of warfare are drawn up in 1923? So what do they try to restrict?
Well, I mean, the heritage goes back even before the First World War, because of the potential that balloons were. Nobody thought that powered aircraft at that time in 1903 or 1907, 1899 and 1907, the Hague Conventions. Nobody thought powered aircraft could drop bombs or anything like that. Much too small and flimsy and wouldn't really work properly. But they thought that dirigibles and balloons could do so, and of course they did. The Zeppelins did in the First World War, and they forbid dropping explosives on any civilians at all. The 1923 Hague Rules, which are even the wording is very similar, by the way, to current conventions, said that you can attack civilian targets if it furthers your military objectives, but that civilians should not be targeted deliberately, as Douhet was advocating. So you have this tension, and we've got it today, you have it literally today when, if a drone strikes an Islamic State target in Syria, for example, the Russians hit a hospital in Aleppo, then all sides are claiming that there was a military advantage. We were attacking a military target, and, the civilians are unfortunate collateral damage. And that tension has been there really since the start. But saying since the start, that's not quite right. Since the First World War, that tension's been there.
It often comes back to cash, and lack of it, and everyone's trying to either pay off the First World War, and then we obviously have the oppression towards the end of the 20s into the 30s, which then causes monetary problems. So I wondered, with that sort of in mind, how much interwar development of military aviation could be built around national interest? So the army can claim that bombers can be used to police the empire. So can we have more of those rather than necessarily concentrating on other things? And were other countries sort of coming up with similar excuses to try and bolster their air forces to the various exchequers of the world?
Well, speaking first to the British, and I'll just then touch briefly on France. At the end of the war, Britain was completely bankrupt, as I think most of those listening will know. But he had a very large Royal Air Force, about 220,000 people. He had 20,000 aircraft. And in short order, that was reduced to a nugatory, a couple of hundred aircraft and a few thousand men and a few women. And Trenchard, who was the first Chief of Staff of the Royal Air Force, was faced with his naval and army colleagues who were very keen to absorb the new service into their own back into army and the navy. And Trenchard basically, I don't think it's quite as straightforward as Trenchard having been given or asked for 6 months to prove the Air Force, but that's effectively what happened. And in 1919, the British were faced with a rebellion in Somaliland. There's a rebel called Abdullah Hassan, who was then and remains the national hero of the Somali people. He was extremely effective and ruthless. We would call him ruthless, but he's an effective guerrilla leader who had given the British a runaround for nearly 20 years. Millions of pounds had been spent on trying to bring this guy to battle and kill him, and reduce his force to manageable amounts. And that's been done through the army. And Trenchard said, look, we can solve this problem very quickly. And 4 aircraft were sent out in great secrecy. And to cut a short, very exciting and interesting story even shorter, these 4 aircraft located Hassan's force, and Mullah Hassan was called the Mad Mullah. Abdullah Hassan was called the Mad Mullah by the British. And located his force. A small army unit, or a smaller army unit than would otherwise have been required, then defeated the force in detail. So they were located and defeated in detail very quickly and dispersed. And Abdullah Hassan was killed shortly afterwards. And the whole operation cost £77,000. Now, the previous operations over the few years previous to that and during the First World War, mostly before it, had cost millions. And thereby, Trenchard claimed, look what we can do. For a fraction of the cost of thousands and thousands of troops on the ground, we can solve problems for you. And that approach was repeated again and again in the 1930s by the British in Iraq. This was the origination of the idea of air policing, by the way, which we now have with drones over Pakistan and Yemen and once again Somalia. It's still called the same thing, air policing, in that context anyway. The French used aircraft in much the same role in the Rif rebellion and to subdue some of their other opponents in places like Syria. New roles are being developed as well for those wars: medical evacuation, transportation of troops in Iraq, in Syria. All of this, the overriding purpose was to try to fight wars against insurgents more cheaply, without using vast numbers of troops on the ground. And of course, this was the approach that essentially Rumsfeld was trying to take in 2003 in Iraq. We can substitute vast numbers of troops on the ground with technology. And it couldn't be done in Iraq, and eventually in Iraq in 2003, and eventually in the 1920s, it all began to fall apart as well. As you can't control. You might be able to subdue, but you cannot control from the air.
Does this mean the British and the French sort of more concentrate on the bombers? And possibly the Germans don't see it that way with no colonial interest, so they see their use of air power being elsewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Germans had certainly after the end of the First World War, they had no colonial empire. I suppose the significance of that is that Germans could direct development into technology arguably more effectively than the British and French. And the reason for that was that when your enemies have rifles at best, such as the Iraqi Shia and Sunni rebels from 1919 to 23, or until now really on the Afghan, Indian stroke Pakistani frontiers, there's no incentive to develop high technology aircraft in order to fight these wars. And what the Germans were doing, first of all, they weren't allowed an air force in the 1920s, but it didn't mean they were stopping development. During the 1920s, by far the largest airline in the world and the most efficient was Lufthansa. There's a doctrine of double effect going on there. You can develop a nice airline and develop relatively high-tech airliners, but that can also provide potential air crews for any future bombing campaign, and provide the technology for future bombers, which of course is exactly what it did. Similarly, in the United States, civilian development led military development quite considerably. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps, as it was then called, because they didn't have their own independent air force, but they did have a reasonably robust and semi-detached part of the Army called the Army Air Corps by that stage, which had been founded on the ideas of Billy Mitchell, who was the American version of Douhet, if you like. But the Army Air Corps was considered an inefficient, poorly equipped, and badly manned setup. They lost the contract for U.S. mail in 1934, and it was given to a commercial company because they could do it far more efficiently. So there you have in both Germany and the United States civilian technology, civilian approaches, providing a very solid basis for future development. Whereas as you know, I think everybody knows, many of the listeners will be very familiar with the genesis of such aircraft as Spitfire and its cognates, Hurricane, and what have you. These technologies were based not so much on commercial enterprise, but on sporting enterprises, the Schneider Cup development and so on. The Italians were also heavily involved in that. That was where the development was in the 1920s and early 30s. There was no incentive to develop military capabilities when your enemies simply have no air capability and very limited, if any, anti-aircraft capability.
I wondered if there's a view within the German military in the interwar years to use their aircraft differently than the Allies. With the Germans thinking tactically because they're used to thinking land war, so they're putting their planes in tactically on the battlefield, whereas the British and French with their large empires have been using theirs much more strategically, and they've been much more used to, well, possibly not strategically, but certainly much more used to bombing. So there's a slightly different outlook on how you use the two, use air warfare before the war. I mean, or am I just sort of branching up, going down the wrong road, or branching up the wrong tree? Or No, you're right on track, and you've had contributors make this point that despite the British protestations of having the focus on bombing, which to some extent is true, they had a bomber mafia in the Air Force, they didn't call it that, much the same way as the Americans did, which they did call it that. And the bomber mafia in the US Air Forces remained dominant really until the late 1960s, I guess. But anyway, moving back to your question,
the Germans had this idea of what's called the operational air war, which they perfected really in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was quite ignored. I say ignored. No, not really ignored, but perhaps underplayed in its significance for air power, because it's where German ideas were tried out, and they were developing pragmatic approaches to air power, as many of your listeners will know. Not only through the 1920s, when the training developments going on, much of it, by the way, paradoxically, in the Soviet Union, where they were, given that they were forbidden an air force in Germany, they were developing one in Lipetsk in Russia in exchange for technical development, which they were giving the Russians. But they were also developing a doctrine, and it was a very solid doctrine. The father of it, arguably a fellow called Walter Wever, who was killed in 1936, I think, but he, by that point, developed the Luftwaffe's ideas of exactly what you said, tying the air arm, the Luftwaffe, very closely to the army, the Heer. And those ideas were put into practice in Spain with very great success, I think. The Italians were also involved in Spain with much less success, but the Germans certainly used it as a test bed for a lot of their ideas. The British had no opportunity for trying out their ideas of strategic bombing, and despite their protestations that they were focused on bombing, they managed to acquire a bombing force that could neither find its target nor attack it accurately or get back or there safely by 1939, which was these oversights were extremely costly during the war itself, and the Air Force was seen as the major strategic strike force of the United Kingdom. But if I can just move back to fighters, actually, with an idea that the bomber would, in Britain, that the bomber would always get through, that there's nothing you could do to strike back at bombers. You could shoot a few down, perhaps, with fighters that could catch them, but essentially bombers were going to hit their targets. And the question was, what do you do about it? About the results. Some people didn't buy that. Chief amongst them, of course, Dowding, who had taken over essentially acquisition and supply for the Royal Air Force, administration, acquisition, supply, I can't remember now his exact role, in 1930. And he was an open-minded character who was more than willing to accept that technology could make up for certain unfortunate facts. One of those unfortunate facts was that fighters couldn't catch bombers, nor could they find them. And this was the genesis, of course, of radio direction finding, which ultimately is a force multiplier. It means that you can direct your forces at the right place at the right time without having to cover the whole sky with observers, essentially. And the significance of that, of course, became extremely great during the Battle of Britain, when these systems were tied together very effectively, quite remarkably effectively in 1940. So the idea that the bomber would always get through was not accepted by a relatively small cadre within Britain, who were focused on these ideas, which they hadn't actually prepared for, of what we now call strategic bombing.
That statement, it's Stanley Baldwin who is famous for saying it. Is it his statement, or has he pinched it from somewhere else? It's such a good phrase that sticks.
I don't know the genesis of it. It was a speech in Parliament, 1934, I think, from memory. Is it 32? Yeah.
I think it's 32. My notes say 32, but I might have noted it out wrong. But because I sort of have this idea that we were obsessed with bombing the British, and because of that, if the bomber's always going to get through, what's the point of building fighters? You just got to build loads of bombers, and he who has the most bombers wins.
Well, that's exactly right. That you have a debate in Cranwell at the New Royal Air Force College in 1934, where the motion was essentially fighters are obsolete, and the motion was won. The cadets at Cranwell, who were all going on to fight the Battle of Britain and the bomber campaign, essentially voted the motion that fighters are obsolete and a bit of a playboy toy. But if you look at the situation of technology in the early 30s, that was entirely reasonable, because let's take, for example, the RAF, any air force. This is true. So let's take the RAF. The major fighter of the RAF in the early 30s was called the Bulldog, a Bristol Bulldog. It was a beefy biplane with a radial engine. It could achieve just short, about 170 miles an hour, really, full cock. The major bomber, or the fastest bomber was the Hawker Hart, which was a sleek biplane with a crew of two, which could achieve a speed of about 160 miles an hour. So, assuming you could find bombers, which was an assumption that was perhaps rather hopeful in the skies of Europe, actually catching them was going to be a problem in your biplane without effective radios or any kind of radio direction. So it's entirely reasonable to say that fleets of these bombers could actually get through and do serious damage. Now, the degree of that damage, of course, was massively overplayed in the 1930s, as was discovered, I guess, in the early days of the 1940s. I'm not particularly conversant with the propaganda put out by the British just before 1939-40. I'm sure you know a lot more about that than me, but I think they were expecting that 100,000 casualties would be taken every week by bombers. That obviously didn't happen at a much lower scale. Anyway, getting back to the point, it was entirely reasonable for much of the 1930s until the development of the monocoque fighters, the Spitfire, and to a lesser extent the Hurricane, the Messerschmitt 109, that you simply weren't going to be able to shoot down bombers even if you could find them.
Which is it's a sort of a sobering belief. We're just sort of building fighters to be a sop for public morale, but they're going to be useless. But you've mentioned Billy Mitchell. He's not dissimilar in the States when he's declaring that the Air Force is now more important than the Navy, which strangely is sort of how it worked out during the war.
Well, naval officers are very good.
Well, not more important, but it had a much bit heavier punch than people would have certainly in the 1930s would have ever put down. When nobody's overlooking, everyone overlooks the carriers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. It's all very well looking at the way that the Dauntlesses and the other the torpedo and dive bombers finished off the Yamato and the others, but they were all launched from ships. And essentially were maritime weapons. I don't know how semantic that is. I don't think it is semantic. And as a definition, an aircraft launched off an aircraft carrier is a weapon. But yeah, Mitchell, of course, made his name in the early 20s in America with the Ostfriesland incident, where he essentially challenged the Navy to supply him with a battle cruiser, which they duly did in the shape of a captured German model. 20,000 tons of heavy steel. And it sat immobile, not firing back in relatively clear weather, and not surprisingly was sunk by 1-ton bombs dropped from several waves of aircraft in serially, which is not, by the way, the plan, I should say, agreed with the admirals. So this thing was sunk, and Mitchell duly declared that to send most of the Navy was essentially obsolete and the Air Force could defend America's shores. And this kind of approach did not endear him with his superiors. He was only a 1-star at the time, brigadier general, and he himself wrote a book in the 23 now, I think 24, and he didn't endear himself with his naval and army colleagues, and he was duly cashiered effectively in 1925. But his legacy was extremely strong, and his legacy went right into the Second World War with the way that the Americans conducted their campaign, because it was very well thought out, to be fair to him, focused around looking at an enemy's country as a system of systems. And if you can disrupt those systems, or vital centers as he called them, you could collapse the enemy's economic and military capability. So Trenchard, with his armor focused on morale and the enemy's will to fight. Mitchell looked at the capability. And in the end, I would argue, Angus, and not everybody would agree, I think, but in the end, that's what turned out, if not to be decisive, that approach, Mitchell's approach, but highly effective and really important during the Second World War bombing campaign itself. This idea that you can reduce an enemy's capability to fight through attacking certain industries. And the only question was, of course, and this was the trial and error that dominated much of the early years of the American bombing campaign, what industries are going to be decisive?
I'm sure it's in Spear he points out that they ran out of ball bearings, didn't they? They were down to one ball bearing factory that got knocked out once and then they never visited again and they got it working again. And that's the kind of obtuse thinking. Who thinks of bombing a ball bearing factory? You tend to go for armaments and various other things, but everything needs ball bearings.
Yeah. Schweinfurt and Regensburg. They initially went for ball bearings, and the Americans entered the war with, I think, 142 targets. And the idea, well, we'll destroy these targets, and that will finish the enemy off. And the first two that they tried, which are Regensburg and Schweinfurt in any force, which is in August 1943, they were ripped to pieces by German day fighters, because the assumption that their bombers would always get through because they were better armed than anybody else's and didn't need fighters proved to be less than adequate to the situation over Northern Europe at the time.
Well, I did make a note to myself. I wondered if pre-war doctrine made individual air forces tunnel visioned of what they were doing. So they seemed to develop themselves without awareness of what other people were doing. So my example would be the bomber always gets through. Well, the bomber always gets through. We don't have to worry about fighter support. Oh my good grief, they're all being shot down. And the same with the Stuka. Great for what it does, but when the airspace is shared by Allied fighters, it's a dreadful plane.
It's a very bad plane, to be in. Yes, quite.
And so the interwar doctrine of a lot of the thinking was just tunnel visioned on how they believed it would be, and didn't spend a lot of time looking what everybody else was doing.
Well, yeah, and practicalities. One of the interesting things I dug up in Cranwell Library was the first draft of Noble Franklin's official history of the bombing campaign. And the interesting thing about this guy, Noble Franklin's a very famous historian, post-war historian. He ended up, I think, he ended up director of the Imperial War Museum, very, very major scholar. But he had the very considerable advantage of having been a navigator and done a tour of as a navigator in Bomber Command. So his official history of Bomber Command's campaign is quite informative, and it's really quite sardonically amusing, certainly the first part. He makes the point, he says, for an air force that intended to use bombing from the air as a strategic instrument, you would think it would be incumbent upon that air force to focus on certain key elements. One of those elements would be finding the target in the day or on the night, and the other of those elements might be hitting it, which is to say navigation and bomb aiming. And this is how he puts it, it's very blunt. Neither of these capabilities were given anything like the attention that they deserved, with the result that we took extremely heavy casualties in the early days in conducting missions that were of little or no effect, which is a pretty good summary, actually, of the early days of the British Bomber Command's campaign against Germany and the rest of their enemies. So yes, it's taking into account the enemy and other actors, such as, in the case of the Americans, the situation over Europe in terms of weather, that if you're trying to drop a bomb into a barrel from 20,000 feet in the Arizona desert, that's one thing. But doing it over Germany when you have extremely bad weather, heavy flak, and extremely determined German fighter opposition is a rather different proposition indeed.
I keep coming back to this because I find it really interesting that Germany seems to have not developed bombing like everybody else. And I made a note. Do you think that's anything to do with Goering? Because he was a fighter pilot, and ultimately he's in charge of the Luftwaffe as opposed to everybody else.
Well, I would trace that back, and I think many other scholars would agree, to 1936 with the death of Walter Weber, who was, as I mentioned earlier, I think, the father of Luftwaffe doctrine, regulation, from memory, I think it's called Regulation 16, set the way that the Luftwaffe approached warfare. And what he wanted was for the German Air Force to develop 4-engine long-range bombers, not to terrorize civilians, but to attack an enemy's bases and ammunition factories. So essentially military interdiction. Operational level, arguably strategic level interdiction, which is basically, of course, what the Americans ended up doing in the Second World War very successfully once they excluded all the other options, when they started hitting the oil and transportation systems. But Walter Weber died in 1936, and he was replaced as General Inspector of the Luftwaffe by a series of people who were not adequate to the task, it's fair to say, like First World War pilots, friends of Goering, or people that didn't get on with other elements of the Luftwaffe. And these bombers ended up never really getting developed, with the result that when they did try a strategic air campaign against Britain, they didn't have the kit adequate to it, which they could have had if they'd have started in sort of 35. Of course they could, but they simply hadn't developed that. that kit. Then what they did have were highly effective machines for cooperation with the army at the operational level for 50, 100 miles behind the lines, but nothing that was going to be able to conduct a separate strategic offensive.
Do you think when we entered into the Second World War that everyone had a part of the solution and no one had the whole solution? So by the end, everyone had taken a bit from everybody else.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And figured it out.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. Yeah. To be fair to the British and Americans, they did learn, this, what you might call syncretism, of taking little pieces from your enemy and adapting it to your own doctrine. The British did this quite effectively, especially at the tactical level. So they looked at what the Germans did, and they thought, we can out Luftwaffe or out blitz the blitzers. And I mean, you had somebody on dealing with Collishaw, Air Commodore Collishaw, and he had clearly, in the Western Desert campaign, and your listeners may recall, he was Group Commander of the Western Desert Air Force for the early days. And his successor, and indeed was commander actually, is Air Marshal Cunningham and Air Chief Marshal Tedder. And these were extremely flexible. And they looked at the way Luftwaffe did things, and they thought, you know what, we can adapt this, and we can make it better. And they did that in spades. So they took what the Luftwaffe were doing well and adapted it to their own requirements extremely effectively. And the Americans took that on board, as the Americans will, very quickly in the Western Desert in 1943. And that doctrine that they developed, that the Americans developed for air-land cooperation, essentially, in its essences, derived from Cunningham, derived in turn from Collishaw, derived from the Luftwaffe, remains valid today. That air and land are co-equal. One is not superior to the other. So that idea that you mentioned there, that syncretism, is quite pithy.
If we go back all the way back to the start and we look at Douhet and his command of the air, if we stood there at 1945, how much was he proved right in his 1921 book?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? You still get people who believe that Air Chief Marshal Harris, who espoused from 1942 onwards area bombing of German habitation on civilians, essentially, worked.
I'm right in saying that there's a section in Douhet's book about that, where you destroy so many houses, and he has some. Is it him who has the statistic on how it affects morale and things?
Yeah, and that idea, although Trenchard didn't read Douhet, I'm sure he didn't, was very Trenchardian. Harris was asked by, as actually an Australian officer, did you ever read Douhet? And Harris said, no, I didn't need to. He had his own ideas. But if you look at the Operation Gomorrah, which annihilated Hamburg in late 1943 in one two-night raid, Albert Speer said, 5 more of these and we are done for. So it's arguable, and I don't think true, but it's arguable that had the RAF persisted with several of these maximum effort raids on relatively, and been as lucky, if you can put it that way, as they were over Hamburg, they might have succeeded. But I don't think that's tenable. I think it's a very selective argument. So no, Douhet, I think, was not shown to be right. And what most people would say now, I think, including the American and British bomber surveys at the end of the war, was that strategic bombing of civilians just didn't achieve its objectives. What did achieve their objectives, though, what did achieve its objective was the more American approach, or this would be my argument, of attacking particular industries. And the industry they hit upon mid-44 effectively was, and onwards, was continuing effort. And you made the point earlier that in order to be effective on anything, you have to continue hitting it on oil and transportation. So if you split up a country's industrial capability, so it's very difficult to get raw material from one place to another, or to transport anything, and you combine that with an assault on fuel supplies, then you have a recipe for success. But of course, in order to do that, you need, and this is where Douhet does come in, command of the air. And the Americans hit on that very, very effectively in early 44. with the introduction of long-range fighters, particularly the P-51. And by the way, the story of the P-51 is really fascinating. It was developed for the RAF as a sort of stopgap for, in 1942, 43, as I recall. And when it was tested by the RAF, the test pilot noticed, I can't remember his name now. He may be I think he is very well known. I can't remember his name now. Sorry, it's gone out of my head. But he noticed that the length of a Merlin engine was the same as the Allison engine that P-51 had before. So he said to his fitters, look, guys, try a Merlin engine and we'll go for a fly this afternoon. And it's as simple as that. They put a Merlin engine in a P-51 and it made the difference. It was very lucky this test pilot happened to be testing this for the RAF. So somehow, again, fortuitously, and Stephen Budiansky actually talks about this, I can't claim this for myself, very fortuitously, this information got back to the US. Merlins were stuck in them, and these became, without question, the finest fighter of the war. And the key thing about them, Angus, was that, of course, they could escort B-17s and B-24s to their targets in as far as eastern Germany, way beyond Berlin, and back. And Adolf Galland, who took over as commander of German fighters in 1941, he said, when we saw P-51s over Berlin, we knew it was lost, because we simply couldn't deal with this. And they combined that technical introduction with an operational and tactical instruction to the operators, to the fighter pilots. Your job is not to, this was early 44, is not to defend bombers, it's to go after the Luftwaffe. Shoot them down in the air, hit them on the ground, kill them wherever you can find them. And this the Americans did with very great success. And again, it's nothing new here. That attritional effect of taking up to 50% casualties on each squadron every month took a fatal toll on the Luftwaffe, so that they were completely beaten essentially, although some would say that the introduction of jets might have made a difference, including Adolf Galland himself. So by the end of 1944, they were not in effect. No, they were not challenging for control of the air.
Yeah. You'd be shot down for favouring the P-51 over the Spitfire.
The Spitfire is a point defence fighter, short-range point defence fighter, was superlative for its needs, but it didn't have the legs to propel itself over Germany.
I don't think it was quite as versatile either. You couldn't get as much mounted on its wings. Even the Mustang, the Hurricane, you get was more useful in that respect, more of a utility tool.
Yeah, very, very tough, very rugged. They stuck all kinds of ordnance, as you know, on the wings, particularly in the Western Desert Campaign. Up to 37mm guns, I think they had on them for anti-tank purposes. And then, of course, towards the end of the war, we had things like Typhoons and Tempests, which you could stick anything on. These became the British equivalent of the not so much P-51, but the P-47 Thunderbolts. Very heavily armed, very beefy, difficult to hit, difficult to shoot down, I should say. So you have all this technical development combined with the Americans hitting upon the importance of focusing on control of the air and targeting the right targets. Now, unfortunately, and this is big hand stuff, because this is not the whole Royal Air, but much of the Royal Air Force was engaged in doing exactly what the Americans were doing. But Bomber Command, the 4-engine Bomber Command, under Harris, I should rephrase it, Harris never really lost the idea that if we keep malleting German cities, this will win us the war. And it was, in every sense, a destructive approach.
Well, by that time it was self-fulfilling. The bomber really could get through by the end of the war. If you just kept at it, there wouldn't be much left to. But of course, the Americans were much better at pinpoint, because they had is it the northern sight that could hit a pickle barrel from God knows how many tens of thousands of feet away?
Oh, the northern sight is very interesting. Yeah, it was the most expensive development program of the 1930s. The only thing that challenged it in terms of in real terms, single item, was the Manhattan Project. It was considered a secret weapon, the secret weapon of the American bomber force, along with the B-17. And your bombardiers, the bomb aimers, were the key members of the aircraft crew on a B-17, which, of course, being so heavily armed, always going to be able to batter its way through in formations that were designed to resist any fighters from any direction. And once they got to the target, yes, they were going to put a bomb in a pickle barrel, as you say. And as I hinted earlier, perhaps, you might be able to do that over Arizona. But the number of 128mm radar-guided guns in Arizona, very limited, cloud formations, and above all, of course, for most of the war, very capably flown German fighters. They were at a premium over the skies of Arizona, but not over Germany.
Indeed. Perhaps we should get you back sometime, Frank. We could pick through the bomber campaign. Thanks for joining me, loyal listeners. If you want more on the history of aerial warfare through to the modern day, Frank's book is Aerial Warfare: Battle for the Skies. It's not a weighty tome. It's a cracking read. As ever, I'll put a link on the website. If you use Facebook, give the World War II podcast page a like. I do try and post things there in support of the latest episode. And don't forget, if you would like to hear more from Frank and I chatting, I will make it available to patrons. That's patreon.com/WW2podcast. So that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.